We are going to talk about active voice, consistent tense, and point of view. These are things that are obviously common errors. A lot of people struggle and write in passive voice using inconsistent tenses and use improper points of view. So let's talk about these. Whenever possible, you want to avoid writing in passive voice. Passive voice is when the verb comes before the subject, and it makes meaning very confusing and it makes your sentence longer than it has to be. So an example of passive voice is the research was conducted by Bernard Lowe. So our verb here is conducted and the subject is Bernard Lowe because he's the person conducting the research. We could rephrase that by using active voice, putting the subject before the verb, and saying Bernard Lowe conducted the research. Likewise, if we would say the patient was cared for by the nurse, cared for or cared. Consistent tense is interesting because most people use consistent verb tense when they are writing a paper, although sometimes when it gets muddled is when you're referencing research or something that's happening in a text. When you're looking at something happening in a text, it's always happening in that text. And so you could say that this researcher says and then cite it, and that's the correct way to do that. And we will talk about consistency in point of view is a big one, and it's difficult, I think, for a lot of people. You never want to use first person point of view unless you're referring to yourself as an individual. So you can use I or we if you're referring to work that you did, research that you conducted, the hospital that you work at, because some papers will ask you to talk about that sort of thing and reflect upon those experiences, but you never want to use an editorial we, which is speaking generally. Like when you say we nurses, you're speaking for all nurses, and that's just not acceptable. If you say something like our world, it's just very general, and who even is our? You're having a possessive pronoun here for the word world, and it's confusing. And so you want to avoid those generalizations, the editorial we. So let's try some practice here. The books were placed on the table, the room was cleaned by the custodian, and it has been said. For the first one, he placed the books on the table. You want to put the subject before the verb, so placed is the verb. Who placed? He did.